A police officer was patrolling the snowy forest near the border when he heard a faint, desperate bark carried by the wind. Following the sound, he found a German Shepherd mother tied to a tree, her fur matted with ice, shivering as she shielded her tiny puppy from the freezing cold. She had no collar, no food, and no way to break free, yet in her eyes burned a fierce will to protect her baby at all costs. That moment would pull him into a dangerous investigation of a gang kidnapping police dogs, and what happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and if you believe that every animal deserves a loving home, not loneliness, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see the world. The snow had been falling all day over Miller's Creek, a small, rugged border town nestled between rolling pine-covered hills and stretches of frozen farmland. By late afternoon, the storm had grown heavier, the sky an unbroken sheet of gray, and the air so cold that each breath came out in a sharp plume. The narrow road leading out toward the forest was nearly buried under fresh drifts. Even in this kind of weather, the job didn't stop. Chief David Walker sat behind the wheel of his dark blue Ford police SUV, the heater humming low as he scanned the roadside through the sweeping motion of the wipers. David was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with weathered features shaped by years in law enforcement and long hours outdoors. His dark brown hair was trimmed short, flecked with gray at the temples, and his blue eyes, sharp but not unkind, carried a constant alertness. A decade ago, the loss of his partner in an undercover operation had left him quieter than he used to be, less quick to trust, more patient in reading situations before acting. He had spent the last month juggling routine duties with an ongoing investigation into a disturbing pattern. In the past 6 weeks, 6 working dogs, police canines and large guard dogs from nearby ranches had gone missing without a trace. Tracks in the snow, abandoned collars, and empty kennels were all they left behind. Witnesses were scarce, and the few leads hinted at a group operating across state lines, kidnapping dogs to retrain them into dangerous attack animals for criminal buyers. The sheriff's office was stretched thin, but David had taken the case personally. A gust of wind rattled the SUV, carrying with it a faint, high-pitched sound. At first, David thought it was the creak of trees in the wind. Then it came again, sharper, urgent, and unmistakable. A bark, weak but persistent. He eased the vehicle to the side of the road, killed the engine, and stepped out into the storm. The snow stung his face, instantly numbing the exposed skin. Pulling his navy parka tighter, David turned his head, listening. The bark came again, to his left, deeper into the trees. The forest loomed ahead, tall pines bending under the weight of snow, their branches whispering in the wind. David's boots crunched through the drifts as he followed the sound, each step sinking deep. The cold bit through his gloves, and the air smelled of pine resin and ice. The barking grew more strained the closer he got. Then, through a tangle of snow-laden undergrowth, he saw movement, a flash of sable and black fur. The sight stopped him short. A German Shepherd mother, no more than 5 years old, was tied to a thick spruce with a coarse rope. Her coat, once likely glossy, was now dull and clumped with ice, the sable markings faded under grime. Her ribs showed under her thick winter fur, and her amber eyes were wide with a mix of fear and defiance. She stood protectively over a battered wooden crate set in the snow beside her. David's gaze shifted to the crate. Inside, curled into a tight ball, was a tiny puppy barely a month old, with soft sable fur and a pink nose. The pup's body trembled violently, its nose pressed into its mother's chest as if trying to burrow inside her for warmth. The mother's ears flattened as David approached, a low growl rumbling in her throat, though she didn't move from her post. Even with the rope cutting into her neck, she angled her body to block him from reaching the crate. David crouched down slowly, speaking in a calm voice that years of dealing with nervous animals had honed. "Easy there, girl. I'm not here to hurt you." The dog's breath came in frosty puffs, each exhale revealing the strain she was under. She was thin, exhausted, but still upright, still refusing to abandon her pup. Kneeling in the snow, David took in the scene more carefully. There were boot prints half filled with snow leading away from the tree, at least 2 different sizes. They were fresh enough to still hold shape, but the falling snow was already erasing them. Whoever had left her here hadn't been gone long. He pulled a utility knife from his belt and held it where she could see it. "Let me help you, girl." Her growl softened to a whine, and after a moment she let him inch closer. The rope was frozen stiff, digging into her fur. With a careful slice it fell away, and she staggered slightly before regaining her footing. David draped his thick rescue blanket over her and the crate, tucking it around the puppy. When he reached to lift them, the mother stepped forward as if to follow, her movements stiff from the cold. Back at the roadside, David opened the SUV's rear and helped them inside. He turned the heater to full, feeling the warmth creep back into his fingers as the snow began to melt off his jacket. The mother settled in the corner, curling her body around her pup. The faint whimper from the puppy was quickly answered by a soft lick from its mother. For a moment, David just sat there, watching. Something about the dog's eyes, alert yet guarded, reminded him of the look in the eyes of people he'd pulled out of bad situations, survivors who'd been forced to protect someone else no matter the cost. His radio crackled. It was Deputy Carla Hughes, her voice tense. "Chief, you'll want to hear this. Another ranch dog went missing last night. This one's a trained guard big Rottweiler named Duke. Owner found the chain cut clean." David's eyes flicked to the German Shepherd in the back. She lifted her head, ears pricking as if she recognized the urgency in Carla's tone. "Copy that," David replied, starting the engine. "And Carla, send me any patrol logs from the last 2 nights. I think I might have just found someone connected to all of this." As the SUV pulled away from the snow-choked road, the storm thickened, the forest blurring into white. But in the rearview mirror, he could see the mother's eyes fixed on him, not in fear now, but in wary hope. The wipers swiped furiously, barely keeping the windshield clear as the blizzard thickened over the winding border road. The German Shepherd mother lay curled in the rear compartment, still wrapped in David's heavy rescue blanket, her puppy pressed tightly against her belly. The soft hum of the heater filled the cabin, and for a moment David thought the worst of the night was over. But the road home was long, and the weather showed no mercy. The snowdrifts along the shoulder had grown so high they resembled frozen waves, and the icy surface glinted under the dim glow of the SUV's headlights. Miller's Creek was still miles away, and the route through the hills was treacherous even on a clear day. David kept his hands steady on the wheel, his focus split between the road ahead and the precious cargo in the back. He glanced once in the rearview mirror. The mother's amber eyes met his, steady and unblinking. There was intelligence there, watchfulness. She didn't just notice everything, she measured it. It reminded David of veteran canine dogs he'd worked with in the past, creatures trained to see threats before humans could. The radio crackled again, bringing the voice of Deputy Carla Hughes through the static. Carla was in her early 30s, with auburn hair usually tied back in a practical ponytail, a freckled face that rarely hid her emotions, and a sturdy, athletic build from years of working search and rescue. Known for her quick wit and equally quick temper, she had joined Miller's Creek PD after serving as a military police officer overseas. "Chief, I just got something you'll want to hear," she said, her tone brisk. "One of our trackers found a set of deep tire prints along Old Ridge Trail north side of the border, not far from where you said you picked up. Whoever's in your back seat." David adjusted his grip on the wheel. "How fresh?" "An hour, maybe less. They lead into a clearing where we also found an old chain and a cut length of thick rope. My guess, drop-off point. Looks like your dog and her pup might have been dumped there after a long haul." David's mind worked fast. If that clearing was connected to the abductions, then the people who tied the dog had been close enough that they could still be in the area. "Keep the scene secure," he told her, "and get photos before the snow covers the tracks." "Already on it, Chief." A sharp bark erupted from the back. David's eyes darted to the mirror again. The German Shepherd had risen to her feet, her muscles tense under the blanket, ears pricked forward. Her gaze locked not on him, but on the road ahead. Instinct made him slow down. The headlights swept across a bend, revealing a patch of the road where the snow had frozen into a treacherous glaze. The SUV's tires skidded, sliding toward the steep embankment. "Easy," David muttered, steering into the skid, easing off the accelerator. The dog barked again, sharper this time, and David braked just enough to regain control. The SUV's back end fishtailed before gripping, settling them safely back in the lane. His heart thudded. Another few seconds at his previous speed and they'd have gone over the edge. "Good girl," he said aloud, glancing back at her. She blinked once, almost as if acknowledging the thanks, then sank back down beside her puppy. They continued down the twisting road, David driving slower now. The storm raged harder, howling through the trees like something alive. In the occasional gaps between snowbursts, the forest revealed brief glimpses of movement shadows too large to be deer. It was impossible to say whether it was just the weather playing tricks or someone out there watching. The radio came to life again, but this time it was Officer Mark Delaney, a patrolman in his late 20s. Mark was tall and lanky, with a perpetual look of surprise in his pale gray eyes and a habit of over-explaining every detail he discovered. His inexperience sometimes showed, but he made up for it with relentless energy. "Chief, you're not going to believe this," Mark said, excitement buzzing in his voice. "We just had a tip from a rancher near County Line Road. Said he saw a black van parked in the woods 2 nights ago, license plate covered in mud, back doors open and what looked like cages inside. He didn't think much of it until he heard about the missing dogs." David felt a pulse of confirmation. The pieces were starting to fit, drop-off points, chains, unmarked vehicles. This wasn't random. By the time he reached the outskirts of Miller's Creek, the snow had let up enough for the glow of street lamps to cut through the night. He pulled the SUV into the small heated garage attached to the station, shutting the door against the wind. Gently, he lifted the crate with the puppy still inside, letting the mother step out on her own. Up close, he could see the details he'd missed in the forest. Her right ear bore a tiny notch, as though clipped for identification at some point. Her left front paw had a faint scar running across the toes. Both could be old injuries, but combined with the coded numbers on her neck, they told a story of service and survival. Carla appeared at the garage door, brushing snow from her jacket. Her eyes softened at the sight of the dogs. "Poor things," she murmured, stepping closer. "They're lucky you found them before the storm buried them." "They might be more than just unlucky strays," David replied. "This girl's trained. You can see it in how she watches." The mother dog, still cautious, shifted to place herself between Carla and the crate, her amber gaze unwavering. Carla crouched a safe distance away. "Yeah, she's got the look. Military or canine work, I'd bet on it." David carried the crate inside, the warm air washing over them. For tonight, they'd rest in the small holding area the station used for rescued animals. Tomorrow, the vet would check them over, but as David closed the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, and that the German Shepherd's eyes held more answers than anyone in the room yet realized. The morning after the storm, Miller's Creek was buried under a thick, glittering blanket of snow. The streets were quiet except for the occasional rumble of a plow truck clearing a path through the drifts. Sunlight reflected off rooftops and windows, casting bright, blinding patches of light across the small police station's lot. Inside, Chief David Walker prepared the rescued German Shepherd and her puppy for a trip to Dr. Helen Brooks' veterinary clinic on the edge of town. Dr. Brooks was in her mid-50s, a tall, lean woman with streaks of silver in her chestnut hair. Years of rural practice had left her hands strong and steady, but her eyes retained a gentle warmth. Known for her calm authority with animals and people alike, she had once worked with military service dogs before returning to her hometown. An old injury, a faint limp in her left leg from a horse accident, had never slowed her down, though it made her walk with a deliberate, measured pace. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay from the barn out back. Posters of healthy pets and working canine units lined the walls. Helen met David at the door, her breath visible in the crisp air as she motioned him inside. "Let's get them somewhere warm," she said, kneeling to greet the mother. The dog stood protectively between Helen and the crate containing her pup, ears forward, muscles taut. David kept his voice even. "Easy, girl. She's here to help." It took a moment, but the shepherd allowed Helen to step closer. As Helen's hands moved over the dog's neck, she froze. "David, look at this." She gently parted the fur on the left side of the dog's neck, revealing a patch where the hair had been clipped close. Beneath it, a faintly raised alphanumeric code had been tattooed into the skin. Just above it was a long, pale scar, too clean to be from an accident. Helen's expression tightened. "That's a canine identification mark. This girl's not just a stray, she was registered in a working dog unit at some point." David crouched beside them, reading the code. "Can you trace it?" "I'll contact the database," Helen replied. "It could tell us where she trained and maybe who she belonged to before all this." The mother dog shifted slightly, brushing against David's leg. Her eyes stayed alert, scanning the room even as her pup let out a small yawn from the crate. As David stood, he glanced out of the clinic's front window and froze. A man stood across the street, leaning casually against a faded green pickup truck. Even from this distance, something about his stance was off. He was in his late 30s, average height, wiry build, with close-cropped dark hair and a patchy beard. His jacket was army surplus, his boots worn but well-maintained. He wasn't watching the street. He was watching the clinic. David's instincts flared. He handed the leash to Helen. "Stay here a minute." Pushing open the door, he crossed the snowy street. "Can I help you with something?" he called. The man's eyes flicked to David, assessing him quickly. Without a word, he pushed off the truck and started walking away, his pace steady but unhurried. David followed just long enough to catch the license plate as the man climbed into the pickup. The shepherd must have seen him too. Through the clinic's window, she barked sharply, ears pinned and teeth bared. The truck's engine roared, and within seconds it was gone. When David returned, Helen was crouched by the dog again, speaking softly to her. "She didn't like him," Helen said without looking up. That reaction wasn't fear. It was recognition. David nodded. "I got his plate. We'll run it through the system." The mother dog's gaze followed him as he made the call to dispatch, her expression unreadable but intense. He couldn't shake the thought that she knew more than they could guess and that her past was about to become the key to unraveling everything. The morning sun had turned the snow in Miller's Creek into a dazzling sheet of white, but the bitter cold still clung to the air. David Walker stood beside his police SUV in the station's lot, the German Shepherd mother now temporarily nicknamed Grace at his side. Her breath came in soft plumes, her amber eyes scanning the surroundings with the same wariness he'd seen the day before. Deputy Carla Hughes approached, pulling her thick parka tighter around her. "Got something for you," she said, holding up a printed photo. It was a close-up of tire impressions found along old ridge trail deep grooves with a distinctive tread pattern. "These match the prints from where you found Grace." David nodded. "Good, we follow them back. Let's take her with us. If she recognizes the area, she might lead us to something we missed." They set off in 2 vehicles, David driving the SUV with Grace and her puppy in a secured crate, Carla following in a pickup loaded with field gear. The tracks led them off the main road and onto a narrow logging trail winding into the forest. The deeper they drove, the more the trees closed in, their snow-laden branches bending low. Eventually, the trail became too tight for the vehicles. They continued on foot, the crunch of boots on snow breaking the otherwise heavy silence. Grace walked ahead, her nose low to the ground, tail rigid. Every few steps she glanced back at David, as if making sure he was still following. After about 20 minutes, Carla raised her hand. "Over there." Through the pines, a weathered structure came into view. A small, single-room shack with a sagging roof and walls patched with mismatched boards. The front door hung ajar, snow drifting inside. David stepped through first, flashlight cutting across the gloom. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rust and wet fur. Against one wall stood 3 large metal cages, their bars bent and scratched. A coil of heavy chain lay on the floor next to an empty water bucket. "Someone's been here recently," Carla murmured, pointing to a dented food bowl. "Still smells like kibble." Grace stiffened, hackles rising. She padded toward the back wall, sniffing intently at a corner where snow had blown in through a warped plank. Then, without warning, she moved to the outside of the shack, circling until she reached a mound of snow partially covering a heavy wooden hatch. David knelt, brushing snow away. The hatch had a metal ring for a handle, and when he pulled it open, the hinges groaned. Beneath was a short, steep stairway descending into darkness. Carla shone her flashlight down. Storage? Let's find out, David said, starting down. The space below was cramped and musty, lit only by their beams. Against one wall stood a makeshift workbench littered with worn leather muzzles, shock collars, and thick leather leashes. A large wooden crate sat open. Inside it a stack of burlap sacks stiff with dried stains. Carla's jaw tightened. Training gear. Not for pets, for combat. Grace prowled the room's perimeter, nose twitching. She stopped at a corner, sniffed the ground, then gave a sharp bark. David followed her gaze to a small shelf lined with unlabeled tins. Opening one revealed dried meat, likely used as training bait. They climbed back into the open air, the cold biting harder after the basement's stale warmth. David made a quick radio call to dispatch, instructing them to send a forensics team. As they packed up to leave, a voice called from the tree line. "David Walker? That you?" He turned to see Mrs. Edna Calloway, a longtime resident of Miller's Creek, trudging through the snow with surprising speed for someone in her late 60s. Edna was short and round, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She'd run the town's post office for decades and knew everyone's business usually before they did. "What are you doing out here, Mrs. Calloway?" David asked. "Looking for my nephew's lost hound," she said, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "But I'll tell you something I saw a while back, might mean something to you." She pointed at Grace. "That dog of yours? Saw her a few months ago, down by Miller's Crossing. She was with 3 men, strangers, all of them. They had her on a short chain, and she didn't look happy about it. One of them, big fellow with a scar on his chin, kept yanking her along like she was luggage." David exchanged a glance with Carla. "You're sure it was her?" "Positive," Edna said firmly. "I don't forget a face, or a dog's face for that matter." Grace, as if understanding, stepped closer to Edna, sniffed her coat, then turned back toward David, ears pricked. It was one more piece of the puzzle, and it made David certain they were closing in on the people who had taken her. The day after the discovery in the forest shack, the evidence room at Miller's Creek Police Department was crowded with boxes, labeled bags, and the faint metallic smell of cold steel from the confiscated cages. Snow tapped softly against the frosted windows, a steady reminder that winter wasn't letting go anytime soon. Chief David Walker sat at his desk, a file spread open in front of him, while Detective Samuel Sam Whitmore scrolled through a laptop beside him. Grace lay at David's feet, her head on her paws, the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing broken only when a sound from the hallway caught her attention. "I've run the tattoo code through the National Canine Registry," Sam said finally, turning the screen toward David. "Matches a German Shepherd named Athena, 5 years old, female, trained as a narcotics detection dog for the Claiborne County Sheriff's Department, 2 states over." David scanned the file. "Reported missing during a warehouse raid 6 months ago. Handler injured, couldn't give a clear account of what happened after she chased a suspect inside." Sam nodded. "She wasn't lost, she was taken, and she's been off the radar ever since. Until you found her." David's gaze dropped to Grace Athena, who had lifted her head, watching the 2 men with quiet intensity. "So, the people who took her, they're the same ones running the operation we just found in the forest." Sam clicked to another page. "I traced that green pickup's plate from yesterday, registered to a Jonathan Riker Pryor convictions for animal trafficking, operating unlicensed kennels, and transporting stolen property. He's connected to a man named Earl Maddox, mid-40s, ex-dog trainer for private security firms. Maddox's name comes up in half a dozen unsolved cases involving missing canines." David's jaw tightened. "And now they know she's here." Across town, inside a dim back room of a rundown auto repair shop, 3 men sat hunched over a scarred wooden table. Earl Maddox's broad shoulders seemed to fill the space, his shaved head catching the weak light from a single bulb overhead. A jagged scar slashed down his chin, pulling taut when he spoke. "They've got Athena at the Millers Creek PD," Earl said, voice low but vibrating with tension. "Walker's the one who found her." Jonathan Riker paced at the far end of the room, wiry frame twitching with restless energy. "She's worth more than every other mutt we've pulled this month. We can't let her stay there. Too much training, too much value." A third man, Caleb Knox, younger and heavier, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Police station isn't exactly easy pickings." Earl's eyes narrowed. "We're not hitting them now. We watch. We wait. When they get complacent, we take her back. And when we do, nobody's going to trace her again." Back at the station, David took Grace outside for a short walk around the block. The snow had crusted over, crunching under his boots. The town was quiet except for the occasional sound of a plow in the distance. They were passing a row of parked cars when Grace suddenly stopped dead. Her ears shot forward, hackles rising. A low growl rumbled through her chest. David followed her gaze to a green pickup idling near the corner. Through the windshield's glare, he could just make out the driver, dark hair, hard eyes, watching them. Grace barked once, sharp and furious, pulling against the leash. The driver shifted in his seat, then eased the truck into gear and drove away without a word. David's pulse quickened. He pulled his phone from his coat. "Carla, it's the same truck from yesterday. Get me every camera feed from Main Street in the last 20 minutes. An hour later, in the station's operations room, Carla pulled up grainy footage from a gas station camera. The green pickup had passed through twice once heading into town, and again leaving just after David's walk. "They're circling," Sam said, arms folded. "They want her back." David looked at Grace through the glass of the kennel door. She was sitting now, eyes locked on the hallway as if she expected the truck's driver to walk through it at any second. "They're not just going to want her," David said quietly. "They're going to try." The cold had sharpened with nightfall, the kind that bit through heavy coats and made breath hang in the air like smoke. Miller's Creek slept under a blanket of snow, but in the police operations room, there was no hint of rest. Chief David Walker stood over a table scattered with satellite images, floor plans, and hastily drawn maps. The warehouse, a squat concrete structure on the edge of an industrial park just outside town, was the target. Every credible lead pointed there. Truck sightings, heat signatures from drone surveillance, and most damning, a tip from a former informant about the place where the valuable ones are kept. Detective Sam Whitmore traced a gloved finger over the plan. "Main floor's open space loading area here, kennels here, but this back wall, could be storage, could be holding cells, no windows." Carla Hughes leaned in, tightening her ponytail. "We go in quiet. We don't have to spook them into moving the dogs before we reach them. If they think we're doing a normal sweep, they might stall." David glanced at the far end of the room, where Grace lay on a blanket beside her crate. She was alert, ears swiveling at every shift in tone. Her puppy slept soundly, oblivious to the tension in the room. The special response team from the state had arrived an hour earlier, led by Captain Renee Foster. In her late 30s, tall and lean, with a long stride and an air of contained intensity, Renee had a reputation for running clean, precise operations. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight braid, her Navy tactical uniform immaculate. Years ago, she'd been an animal cruelty investigator before joining law enforcement, and her disgust for operations like this ran deep. "You know the drill," Renee said, her voice level but carrying authority. "Entry team breaches the east door. Containment covers the loading dock. Walker, you and your dog." She nodded toward Grace. "Come with me. If she reacts to something, we follow her lead." The convoy moved under cover of darkness. Headlights dimmed until they reached the industrial park. The warehouse sat at the end of a snow-packed access road, its metal siding dulled with rust. A single light over the loading bay cast a cone of yellow onto the icy pavement. David stepped out, the crunch of his boots echoing in the stillness. Grace padded beside him, her breath steaming in the frigid air. Her posture was taut head forward, tail low but stiff. The breech was fast and silent. A muffled thump, the door swung in, and the team slipped inside. The smell hit immediately. Stale urine, unwashed fur, and the acrid tang of disinfectant. Rows of cages lined one wall, the whimpering and low growls of frightened dogs filling the dim space. Carla moved quickly with bolt cutters, freeing the nearest animals. Sam tagged each cage with evidence markers while officers led the dogs outside to waiting transport vans. Grace sniffed along the wall, ignoring the open cages. She reached the back of the warehouse and stopped at a steel door with a heavy padlock. Her bark was sharp, urgent. David stepped up, testing the lock. "We've got something here." Renee waved a breacher forward. A hydraulic spreader popped the lock, and the door swung inward to reveal a narrow hallway ending in another locked door. Grace surged forward, nose working furiously. Inside, the second door opened to a smaller room lit by a single bare bulb. 4 tiny German Shepherd puppies huddled in a corner crate, their fur thin and eyes wide. A water dish sat empty beside them, and the air was stifling. "Got them," David called. 4 pups alive." As an officer knelt to lift the crate, David's gaze fell on a clipboard hanging near the door. Pages of neatly typed entries listed lot numbers, breeds, training stages, and sale prices, some reaching 5 figures. A separate envelope held photographs of individual dogs, each with a note of the buyer's location. "This is it," David said, passing the clipboard to Renee. "This ties them to interstate trafficking." Outside, the barking of freed dogs carried through the night. The operation moved like clockwork officers sweeping every corner, animals loaded into rescue vans, evidence bagged and tagged. David watched as Grace approached the crate of puppies, sniffing each one in turn. Her tail gave a faint wag, and she sat beside them until they were carried out. "She found them," Renee said quietly. "Without her, we'd have missed that room." David nodded, pride tightening in his chest. "She's more than evidence, she's part of the team now." By the time the last van pulled away, the warehouse stood empty except for the echo of boots on concrete. The evidence they'd gathered, sale lists, photographs, and physical proof of the animals' conditions, was more than enough to dismantle the ring. But David knew it was only one piece of the fight. Somewhere out there, the leaders who had ordered these dogs taken were still free, and they wouldn't forget about Grace. The snow in Miller's Creek had begun to soften under the pale sun, melting into rivulets along the curbs and rooftops. For the first time in weeks, the air carried a hint of spring, though the ground was still hard underfoot. Inside the small municipal building, Chief David Walker sat at his desk, a stack of adoption papers neatly aligned in front of him. Across from him, Marilyn Grant, the town's animal control officer, adjusted her glasses as she scanned the forms. Marilyn was in her early 50s, with short-cropped silver hair and a kind face that carried the faint lines of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. She was meticulous and protective when it came to animals, a trait that had earned her the respect of both the community and law enforcement. "You're sure about this, Chief?" Marilyn asked, tapping her pen against the papers. "Taking them both on? It's no small responsibility." David glanced down at the German Shepherd lying at his feet. Her coat gleamed now, the rough patches from weeks ago replaced by a healthy sheen. The puppy, smaller but unmistakably her son, was curled against her side, his tiny head resting on her front paw. "Yes," David said simply. "They're family now." Marilyn smiled faintly, signing the last page. "Then it's official. Welcome home, Grace and Buddy." The days that followed saw a transformation not just in Grace and Buddy, but in David himself. Grace adapted quickly to life at David's modest, cedar-sided house on the edge of town. She followed him from room to room, never intrusive but always close, her eyes alert and thoughtful. Buddy, still clumsy on his oversized paws, explored every corner of the yard, chasing drifting leaves and barking at his own reflection in the kitchen door. During his patrol shifts, David began taking Grace along in the SUV. At first, she rode in the back, quietly observing the passing streets. But soon she seemed to anticipate his routes, leaning forward when they approached certain areas, ears pricked. More than once, her sudden attention led David to notice things he might have otherwise missed. A suspicious car idling behind a closed shop, a man lingering too long near the school fence. One afternoon, while on foot patrol along Main Street, David and Grace stopped outside Parker's Diner. The diner's owner, Lydia Parker, was a warm, round woman in her late 40s with a voice that could be heard half a block away. She bustled out from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, if it isn't the town's newest celebrities," she said, crouching to scratch behind Grace's ears. "I saw the article in the Gazette. You've got half the county talking, Chief." The article Lydia referred to had run on the front page of the Millers Creek Gazette just 2 days earlier. It detailed the raid on the warehouse, the rescue of the dogs, and the adoption of Grace and Buddy. There was a photograph of David kneeling beside Grace, Buddy in his arms, both dogs looking directly into the camera. The response had been overwhelming letters from other canine handlers, donations to animal rescue groups, even offers from trainers wanting to help rehabilitate the other rescued dogs. "It's good for people to see," David admitted. "Maybe it'll make them think twice about what's happening out there." Grace took her new role seriously. On night patrols, she moved with quiet focus, her head turning to follow even the faintest sound. David noticed how pedestrians gave her a respectful berth, sensing her calm authority. She was not aggressive, but her presence carried weight, a silent message that trouble would not be ignored. Buddy, too young for work, spent his days under the watch of Marilyn at the Animal Control Office when David was on duty. Marilyn doted on him, and by the time David returned in the evenings, the pup would bound toward him with unrestrained joy. One evening, after a particularly long shift, David sat on the porch with Grace stretched out at his feet and Buddy dozing in his lap. The air was crisp, the sky awash with stars. He thought about the night he'd found Grace tied to that tree in the snow, about the sharp bark that had warned him of danger on the icy road, and about the moment she'd led him to the hidden room in the warehouse. "You've saved more lives than you know," he murmured, scratching behind her ear. Grace's tail thumped softly against the wooden porch. For the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of peace, not because the job was done, but because he knew he wasn't doing it alone anymore. The first snow of December had come early and heavy, blanketing Millers Creek in white. The streets glittered under strings of holiday lights, and the scent of pine and wood smoke lingered in the air. In the front window of David Walker's cedar-sided home, a modest Christmas tree stood decorated with simple ornaments, most of them hand-me-downs from his late parents. Inside, the living room glowed in the warm flicker of the fireplace. David sat in his old leather armchair, a mug of steaming coffee in hand. On the rug before him, Grace lay stretched out, her head resting on her paws, eyes half closed. Beside her, Buddy gnawed happily on a braided rope toy, his oversized paws and clumsy movements making David smile. It was the first holiday season in years that the house didn't feel empty. That morning, the mail had brought a thick stack of envelopes, each one addressed to Chief Walker and Grace. Some were from townsfolk, others from far beyond Millers Creek. The return addresses read like a map of the country. K-9 units in Arizona, a rescue group in Oregon, even a letter from a retired police chief in Maine. David sat at the kitchen table to read them. One was written in neat cursive on stationery embossed with a paw print. "Dear Chief Walker, we heard about Grace's story in our local paper. My K-9 partner went missing 5 years ago during a raid. We never found him. Knowing that Grace not only survived but helped save others has given me hope again. Thank you for bringing her home." It was signed, Officer Miguel Alvarez, San Antonio, PD. David set the letter down, his throat tight. Grace had not just survived, she'd become a symbol for others, a reminder that even when something precious was lost, it could sometimes be found again. In the late afternoon, Marilyn Grant stopped by with a small basket of homemade gingerbread cookies. She was bundled in a red scarf and thick wool coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Thought you and your 2 partners here might enjoy these. she said, stepping inside and shaking snow from her boots. She crouched to scratch behind Grace's ears. "She looks good, Chief. Happier." "She is," David said. "We all are." Buddy trotted over, tail wagging, and tried to stick his nose into the basket. Marilyn laughed and handed him a small, dog-friendly biscuit she'd baked herself. That evening, David lit the fire in the hearth. The flames cast a soft, golden light across the room. Grace moved closer to the warmth, her amber eyes catching the glow, and Buddy curled against her side. Outside, snow drifted past the window in lazy spirals. David leaned back in his chair, letting the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of the dogs fill the quiet. He thought back to the moment he'd first heard Grace's bark through the storm, the sight of her tied to that tree with Buddy pressed against her. He remembered the raids, the arrests, the moment she'd led him to those hidden puppies in the warehouse. She had changed his life in ways he hadn't expected, reminding him why he'd joined the force in the first place, and showing him that loyalty and courage could come from the most unexpected places. Around 9, his phone buzzed with a message from Captain Renee Foster. "Evidence fully processed. All charges filed. Case closed. Have a peaceful Christmas, Walker. You've earned it." David smiled faintly, setting the phone aside. The case was over. Grace was safe, and for the first time in a long time he felt as if the town and his own life was at peace. He reached down to rest a hand on Grace's back. She stirred, glancing up at him before resting her head again, her trust in him complete. "Welcome home," he said quietly. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside the warmth held. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not in the thunder of the skies or the parting of seas, but in the quiet moments when love and loyalty find us in our darkest hours. Grace was once abandoned in the cold, yet through courage and compassion she became a beacon of hope, not just for David, but for everyone who heard her story. It is a reminder that God often works through unexpected messengers, and that His plan can turn pain into purpose. In our own lives, we may face winters of loneliness or hardship, but if we keep our hearts open, God can place in our path the very soul that will change everything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Comment below where you are watching from, and write Amen if you believe that God still works miracles. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of faith, love, and second chances. May the Lord bless and protect every one of you.
The wind had begun to shift over the highway bend, not harsh, just enough to carry the dry breath of sagebrush and the distant rattle of a loose sign swaying over an empty gas station. A rusted pickup rolled to a stop on the shoulder just past mile marker 214, its brake lights pulsing briefly before vanishing altogether. Dust curled around the tires, then drifted out across the road like a veil unraveling. A door creaked open, then silence. The man stepped out slowly, mid-50s, weather-scored face, shoulders pulled tight, as if every bone had been bracing for this moment longer than he cared to admit. His clothes were plain, road-dirty. Someone who'd long since stopped caring how others saw him. He kept glancing at the horizon like it owed him an answer, but it didn't give one. Behind him, the dog waited. It was a German shepherd, older, grizzled around the muzzle, with a broad chest and the kind of deep-set eyes that made people think twice about looking too long. Not quite young, not quite old, but with that alert stillness dogs get when they sense something wrong in the tone of your voice, even if the words say nothing. The man opened the tailgate. He didn't speak, didn't pat the dog goodbye, or even look directly at it. He just stood still for a beat too long, like he'd rehearsed this, and now didn't know how to deliver the lines. Then, with a curt motion, he gestured. "Go on," he muttered, barely audible under the low hum of a passing semi-truck, but the dog didn't move. The man's jaw twitched. Get go. Still nothing. He reached for a crumpled fast food bag on the seat and tossed it into the grass, a half-eaten burger tumbling out, wrapper still clinging to it. The dog looked at the food, then looked back at him, not with accusation. Not even confusion, just ... stillness, the kind that says it knows. From the ridge above, a red-tailed hawk circled once, its shadow gliding over the pavement like an omen. Cars continued in both directions, unaware. Then a woman driving a silver sedan glanced over and saw the man shove the dog with his boot, just enough to force it down off the tailgate. The animal landed awkwardly, one leg buckling. The woman's mouth opened, but the moment was already gone. The man climbed back into the truck and started the engine. The dog stood, slowly, one paw lifted, then another. A hesitant step toward the road, not the food. The woman's car had passed, but she looked again in the rearview mirror, blinking rapidly. The red lights of the truck flared as it accelerated too fast for gravel. The dog began to trot, then run. The pickup curved into the main lane, tires squealing faintly, and behind it just for a few seconds the dog kept pace, not closing the distance, not falling behind, just matching it breathlessly, tail low, legs pounding with all the urgency of memory. Other drivers began to slow. What were they seeing? A stray, a chase, a dog desperate not to be left behind. One man honked, another rolled down his window, shouting something lost to the wind. The truck didn't stop. The shepherd veered toward the embankment, gravel flying behind him. Then, without warning, the animal cut in front of a white SUV. Tires shrieked. A chorus of horns flared, and then silence. The shepherd stood in the center of the highway, not hit, not hurt, just still. The pickup was gone now, disappearing into the orange haze where the sun touched asphalt. For a long second, no one moved. The traffic parted slowly, uncertainly, as if the dog had become something more than an obstacle, a figure, a witness. The animal's chest heaved, dust clung to its fur. It turned its head toward the distant place the truck had gone, and didn't look away. Nobody could say why it hadn't chased further, why it had chosen that moment, that spot, to stop. But every driver who passed remembered the stillness. The animal stood like that for another full minute before finally lowering its head and walking off the road, not toward the burger in the grass, but toward the trees. And as it vanished into the tree line, the wind picked up again, colder now, the kind that made the leaves rustle with something almost like warning. This wasn't over, not yet. The dog moved with purpose now, not hurried, not panicked, but steady, as if some ancient compass inside its chest had shifted, slightly, pointing not toward the man who'd left, but toward something older than the road itself. The trees ahead, sparse and wind-worn, stood like forgotten sentinels beside the highway. Dry leaves scraped across the roots like whispers. The dog stepped across the threshold from asphalt to earth without hesitation. Behind him, the world of humans resumed its noise. Horns, tires, the irritated sigh of commuters, all fading. No one followed. In the quiet of the trees, the light thinned, not dark yet, but leaning that way. The air cooled as shadows lengthened, drawing lines across the forest floor. The shepherd paused once, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring. Something was moving, not near, but not far either. He lowered his head and sniffed the trail. Not prey, not danger, just memory. The scent of old motor oil, tobacco, dried beef wrappers, and hands that used to scratch the space behind his ear on cold mornings. But the scent wasn't fresh, not anymore. He didn't call out, didn't bark, just pressed forward, muscles tight with something between duty and defiance. Half a mile in, the trees opened into a shallow clearing, overgrown grass, a dry creek bed twisted with roots and shattered cans. At the far edge stood a burned-out trailer, half swallowed by weeds. The shepherd stopped and looked straight at it. A rusted folding chair leaned beside the door, bent and missing a leg. Wind tapped its edge against the siding, soft, rhythmic. Hollow. He stepped closer to someone passing by. It would have looked like a stray sniffing for food. But this wasn't scavenging. This was a pattern, familiar, practiced. He circled once, then stood still near the doorway, head cocked slightly, waiting. Inside, there was no movement, just the stale smell of rot and metal. He sat. 10 minutes passed, then 20. And still, he waited. Farther down the highway, the man had pulled into a roadside motel, one of those places where curtains stay permanently drawn and the vending machine hums like it's the only thing alive. He didn't check in right away, just sat in the truck, eyes on the rearview mirror. Not looking for traffic, just looking. The glove compartment was still slightly ajar. A collar rested there, worn leather, tag missing. He closed it with back of his hand, then ran his palm over his mouth. For a long time he didn't move. Eventually he went inside. Back in the clearing, the shepherd rose, not abruptly, with the slow, resigned grace of something that had waited before and learned not to expect. He turned, not toward the highway, but deeper into the trees, past the trailer, toward the edge of a ravine where a broken fence slouched under the weight of years. On the other side, scrub brush and faint trails, and beyond that, nothing paved. He followed it. A thin path curved along the hillside, dusty and half-erased. Coyotes scat nearby, rabbit prints, but the shepherd didn't care. His steps were more confident now, as though something had resolved in him, though the reason remained invisible to all but him. Half an hour later, he stopped again. A pair of headlights glimmered weakly through the branches below. Not moving, parked an old sedan, engine off, windows open. From this distance it looked abandoned, but a faint cough cut through the silence. Human, weak. The shepherd waited, barely breathing, then movement. A boy's arm reached out from the passenger side, trembling as it searched for something on the gravel. His voice was hoarse, unintelligible, but the tone was familiar, not calling to anyone, just calling out. The shepherd tilted his head again, ears twitching. He made no sound, but he stepped forward. From the sedan came another cough and then a sudden thump. The boy collapsing halfway out the door, his breath catching against the dust. The shepherd descended the slope in 3 sharp bursts, paws barely making a sound. He reached the boy, and stopped just short of touching. He sniffed. Not the scent he'd come for, not the man, but familiar, in another way. Hospital soap, sweat, fear, and something else. Faint, metallic, the boy groaned. His eyes opened just enough to register the dog's shape, and didn't flinch. They looked at each other for a long, silent beat. Then the boy reached out, not fast, not desperate. Just a hand, open and unsure. The shepherd didn't move, but his tail gave a single, slow wag. A breeze moved through the dry leaves behind them. The dog turned once to glance toward the trees, as if checking for something no one else could see. Then he stepped forward and laid his head gently beneath the boy's hand. From far down the valley, a low rumble echoed distant thunder, or maybe just the warning growl of a coming truck. Either way, something had shifted, and in that moment, it was no longer clear who had found whom. The trees swallowed him whole. The world behind horns, engines, the smear of rubber on asphalt, faded like an old radio turned down to low, to matter. In front, nothing moved but the tall grass trembling in the wind, the dry leaves shifting like restless thoughts. The German shepherd didn't look back. A low branch brushed his spine. He paused only to lift his paw from a thistle, then pressed deeper. There was no path here, just instinct and a faint, old memory of softer footsteps, of the way things used to smell before the truck, before the silence. A trail of scent perhaps only he could sense, etched not in soil but in something older, more internal. The forest grew thicker, colder, to the south. Storm clouds pressed low, heavy with the weight of something that hadn't yet broken. Shadows lengthened, and up ahead, the clearing. It wasn't much, a drainage ditch and a fallen fence post, but the dog stopped there, crouched low to sniff the earth, and then he lay down. Just like that. His body curled in a familiar gesture, but the stillness wasn't rest. It was memory, waiting, the way he used to wait on porches that no longer stood. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. He didn't bark, didn't whine. But when the old man's truck reappeared, distant, just barely visible through a crack in the tree line, reversing awkwardly down the shoulder, the shepherd did not move. Not at first. Inside the cab, the man sat motionless, one hand gripping the wheel, the other hanging uselessly by his knee. The wind had changed direction again, now carrying the smell of burnt oil and wet bark, maybe something else too. He hadn't expected the dog to follow. Not like that, not into traffic, not past the place he'd left the food, and certainly not this far, as if it knew not just where to go, but how to wait without demand. The man cursed under his breath, not at the dog, at himself. He opened the door, boots crunching gravel, and stood beside the truck. A long time passed before he stepped closer to the tree line. The shepherd lifted his head but didn't rise. "I thought it'd be easier this way," the man muttered, mostly to the air. "Thought maybe you'd take the hint." Still no response, just the sound of leaves shifting. Distant thunder rolled, not close enough to threaten but enough to say time was passing. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered collar. It was frayed around the edges, the tag long since worn blank. He turned it over once, in his hand, then knelt. "You weren't even mine to begin with. You know that." A bird rustled in the canopy above, somewhere far behind. A semi's horn howled, but here in the forest it felt like another world. "She gave you to me when she got sick. Said you'd know when it was time." He stared down at the collar, then slowly at the dog. "But maybe I'm the one who didn't." The shepherd stood now, not tense, not threatening, just present. The man didn't reach out. The storm wind rose, pulling dead leaves through the clearing in little spirals. The dog blinked against the gust, eyes narrowing. Something behind that look, not blame, not quite trust either, but memory, shared memory. He didn't come forward, and the man didn't call him. Instead, he stood, hesitated, then laid the collar gently on the grass between them. "I can't fix the years I wasted," he said quietly. "But if you want to come back, the door's open." Then he turned, walked back to the truck, and left the passenger door wide, and sat. The dog remained where he was. Wind rustled the collar. A distant crack of thunder echoed again, closer now. A few scattered drops tapped the roof of the cab. Still, the dog did not move, but his ears tilted, listening. Not to the man, not to the storm. To something older, something just beginning. The forest swallowed the dog in stages, first his outline, then his limbs, until only the tip of his tail was visible, brushing once against the tall grass before vanishing completely. The cars behind began to move again, but slower, their momentum dulled by something they couldn't quite name. A few drivers turned to look at each other through glass, uncertain whether they'd witnessed a strange accident or something closer to abandonment in its rawest form. No one honked, no one laughed. Done inside the trees, the shepherd walked with no clear destination, only distance. His gait was uneven now, the front right paw carrying the memory of the earlier stumble, but not enough to stop him. Birds scattered from a low branch above. A squirrel froze along a fallen trunk, watching silently as the dog passed. The air in the woods was cooler, thick with damp earth and needles, the sun filtering through like faded memories every few steps. He paused and looked behind him. Not at the road, not at the food, at the nothing, and still he didn't sit. The place he chose to rest wasn't hidden, just far enough to avoid being seen. A slope of earth above a dry creek bed. Roots clung to the bank like twisted fingers, and pine cones crunched underfoot. He laid down slowly, but not entirely. Chest still lifted, ears angled, breath shallow, but alert. Down in the ravine, there was movement, small, erratic, not a predator. A fox kit, barely more than a shadow with legs skidded across the mud. The shepherd watched, unmoving. He did not bark. He did not rise. Just followed it with his eyes, as if reminded of something small and fragile once left in his care. Then came the crunch of leaves, not the random fall of branches, or the wind's slow crawl. This was footstep rhythm. Human weight, measured, hesitant. He was not alone. The woman who had seen him run, the one in the silver sedan, stood now just beyond the tree line. She hadn't planned to stop, had driven 15 minutes before pulling over, putting her head in her hands, and turning back. Now, shoes muddy and breath uneven, she searched the trees with a kind of strange urgency. Not rescue, not guilt, just need. She spotted him when he shifted slightly, his shoulder catching a sliver of dying light. He didn't run, neither did she. Approached. They watched each other across the narrowing space, unsure of rules. Her voice, when it came, was careful, low and unthreatening, like someone speaking near an open wound. Hey boy. He didn't move. She crouched slightly, not to call him over, but just to lower herself to the forest's level, a sign of respect in the wild. Her eyes scanned his posture, the rigid front legs, the twitch at the corner of his muzzle, the too-thin outline beneath the fur. This wasn't a dog left behind for the first time. She opened her coat and slowly pulled something out, not food, not rope, but a soft piece of fabric. A child's t-shirt, light blue, folded, small. He noticed. The wind picked up then, just enough to lift the shirt's corner, revealing a smudge of something dark near the hem. It wasn't blood, just old dirt, dried in streaks. But the way her hand trembled as she folded it back again, there was grief there. Not loud, not messy, just worn into the muscle. I used to bring my daughter here, she murmured, more to the woods than the dog, before everything changed. Still, he stayed. A branch cracked in the distance. Sharp, purposeful. Both their heads turned at the same time. The sound was too heavy for deer. Not enough rustle for wind. Neither spoke, but something in the air had shifted. The woman rose, slowly, eyes narrowing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't watching them, it was waiting. She looked back at the dog, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. His eyes had shifted to, not to her, but toward the space behind her, as if he knew something she didn't, as if he remembered this rhythm before, the sound of movement in the dark. The choice between trust and silence. His body remained tense, but his tail moved once. A flick, barely a breath, and that's when she understood. He hadn't been abandoned once, he had been left before, and come back again and again. The forest quieted suddenly, as though listening for what would happen next. The forest listened. The silence between the woman and the dog stretched like the space between heartbeats, not empty, but full of everything they weren't saying. The sound that had cracked the distance before had faded, folded back into the quiet, as if it had only come to test them, and now it was gone. The shepherd blinked slowly. Not weary now, just tired, a deep, bone-worn kind of fatigue that only settles into animals who have waited too long for something that never came. His chest rose and fell with deliberate calm, but his eyes stayed fixed on the woman, watching not for threat, but for decision. She took one small step forward, no leash, no calling voice, just a quiet breath released into the cooling air. The child's shirt still folded in her palm, trembling. Less now. There was no plan in her mind, no story she could explain, just a feeling she couldn't set down. She didn't understand what had brought her here. Not really. Only that the look in the dog's eyes, steady, wounded, refusing to ask for anything, had met something in her that had long gone unspoken. A crow lifted from a distant branch with a harsh caw, its wings scattering the last light across the tree trunks in ragged flashes. The shepherd didn't flinch. His ears turned to follow, but his body stayed still. Then, quietly, he stood. His back leg trembled slightly at first, then found its balance. He didn't walk toward her, but he didn't walk away. He moved parallel, circling a slow arc through the brush, as if testing the weight of the decision he was about to make. She didn't follow, just lowered herself again, resting the fabric in the crook of an exposed root. She didn't know why. A gesture, maybe, or a signal. The dog paused, near a patch of pine needles where the ground sloped gentle and soft. He sniffed once, lowered his head, and nudged a clump of disturbed soil. Beneath it, barely visible, was a small bundle of decayed cloth and something once plastic. A collar, faded blue, snapped clean in half. The woman covered her mouth, but didn't cry. She didn't need to. Some griefs didn't ask for tears, only recognition. He had brought someone here before. Not the man who had driven away. That much was clear now. The shepherd had returned to this place not out of fear, but memory. This was the place he guarded. Not a home, not a den, a grave. Her voice came again, softer now. You waited, didn't you? The dog didn't move, but the way his shoulders lowered, the way he exhaled through his nose, it was enough. He stepped toward the shirt, gently picked it up in his mouth, and laid it beside the old cloth he'd unearthed. Then he looked back at her, not begging, not questioning, just present. A breeze moved through the trees then, not sharp, not cold. It carried the scent of the earth, the brittle leaves, the faint musk of bark, the kind of wind that feels like an ending, but not quite a farewell. She understood. She rose and stepped closer. This time, he didn't back away. When she reached him, she didn't touch him. She just sat on the ground beside the old grave, hands folded, eyes forward. The dog lay beside her. Minutes passed. The sky above the canopy deepened into a blue that felt almost velvet, the last slant of amber light lingering in the west. A few insects began their evening song. Somewhere far off, a chain of headlights hummed across the highway, oblivious. The woman stood. Eventually, her knees cracked gently. In protest, she looked down at the shepherd who had not slept, but simply watched, calm now, unguarded. She didn't ask him to follow, but when she turned and began walking, slow and open, he rose. And after one last glance toward the resting place, he followed. They crossed the tree line without a word. The forest closed behind them, not as a final chapter, but as something held. Witnessed. The ground would remember. The wind would return. The grave would stay quiet. The road ahead was dim now. The sun had slipped below the edge of the earth, and the sky carried only a faint afterglow, the color of bruised lavender and smoke. Her car sat waiting on the shoulder, hazard lights ticking gently like a heartbeat to slow. She opened the passenger door. The shepherd hesitated for just a moment, then climbed in, not because he was claimed but because he had chosen. As she slid into the driver's seat, she looked over once. He was curled in the footwell, eyes half closed but not asleep, just resting, watching the horizon through the windshield, still alert to the world, but not alone in it. And as she turned the key, the engine low and soft, the first star blinked into view above the darkened treetops. A thin breeze moved across the highway, lifting a single pine needle from the back seat and carrying it out the open window into the air. A small thing, but it drifted like a memory finally let go.